The first thing people noticed was the blood. It ran down the side of the man's face in a thin, dark line, cutting through the dust on his cheek and dripping from his jaw onto the packed earth of the town square. He stood in the center of Red Hollow with his hands chained in front of him, his shoulders straight, his head high, and his silence so steady it seemed to make the whole crowd uneasy. Men had gathered for a show. Women had come for scandal. Children had slipped forward to stare at the stranger everyone was calling dangerous. But now that they stood near him, close enough to see the torn skin at his wrists and the bruises darkening his ribs beneath the ripped shirt, some of them shifted their boots and looked away. Sheriff Nolan Briggs did not look away. He stood on the porch outside the jailhouse with one hand on his belt and the other hooked into the chain that held the prisoner. The afternoon sun flashed against his badge and made his narrow eyes look even meaner. "Step closer, folks," he called, smiling like a man about to sell a horse at auction. "You're looking at the wildest thing ever dragged into Red Hollow. Caught him north of the river after he put one of Preston Hale's men in the dirt and ran off with 2 geldings. Judge says the damage must be covered. That means he gets sold." A wave of muttering moved through the crowd. "Says he's one of them Indians from up in the hills. Looks more beast than man. Bet he gutted somebody. Savage." The word struck the air again and again, but the chained man never flinched. He was tall enough to tower over nearly every man in town, broad through the chest, hard in the shoulders with dark hair hanging loose to his back. His skin was burned bronze by sun and weather. His mouth was cut. One eye was swollen at the corner. Yet there was something in the way he stood, some calm, proud thing that made the insults sound smaller each time they hit him. Sheriff Briggs gave the chain a sharp jerk as if to remind everyone who held power here. "Strong back," he said loudly. "Strong hands. He'll pull a plow, break stock, haul ore, chop timber, whatever a buyer needs. We'll start at $40. No one answered at first. Then old Ben Carter spat into the dirt and lifted a hand. 40. 40 I've got, the sheriff barked. Do I hear 50? 50, said another voice. The bidding started slow, ugly, and cruel. The men spoke numbers the way they talked about cattle. Some grinned. Some stared at the prisoner as though measuring him for labor. A few of the women stood stiff and pale at the edge of the crowd, but not one spoke against it. This was frontier law, rough and dirty and dressed up as necessity. Out here, people told themselves all kinds of evil became acceptable when it wore a legal face. The sheriff opened his mouth to call for 60 when a woman's voice cut through the square like a knife. "Don't hurt him." Everything stopped. Heads turned so sharply that a child stumbled into his mother's skirts. The men near the front stepped aside without meaning to. Through the parting crowd came a woman in a faded blue dress and worn brown boots, walking with the firm stride of someone used to hard ground and harder seasons. Her name was Eleanor Hart, though most people in Red Hollow called her Ellie. She lived alone on the old Hart place east of town, a ranch that had once been respectable and was now one bad winter away from ruin. Her dark blonde hair was pinned back tight, but loose strands had escaped around her face. Her cheeks were flushed, whether from anger or the long walk into town no one could tell. In one hand she held a small leather purse so tightly her knuckles showed white. Sheriff Briggs stared at her in open disbelief. "Mrs. Hart." "I said don't hurt him," Eleanor repeated. Her voice shook once, then steadied. "If he's to be sold, I'll buy him." The silence after that was so complete even the hitching posts seemed to creak louder. Then the crowd broke. "Ellie Hart's gone mad. She can't be serious. That thing will kill her before sunup." Preston Hale, owner of the largest cattle spread in the valley, pushed forward from the crowd. He was a heavy man with a trimmed beard, expensive boots, and the kind of eyes that never looked at anything without thinking about profit. "This is no place for foolishness," he said. "The widow doesn't know what she's saying." Eleanor did not even look at him. Her eyes stayed on the prisoner. "How much?" she asked the sheriff. Briggs recovered enough to sneer. "Current bid is 50. Eleanor opened the purse and took out a wrapped cloth bundle. When she pulled it open, Silver coins glinted in the sunlight. "I have $68. The sheriff blinked. "That all?" "It's enough." A laugh burst from somewhere in the crowd. "She'll spend her last penny on a savage." Mrs. Whitlow, the preacher's wife, clutched her collar. "Eleanor, think what people will say." Eleanor finally turned then, and the fire in her eyes made Mrs. Whitlow fall silent. "I've heard what people say," she replied. "I've heard every filthy word spoken in this square. Call him savage all you want. I see a man worth saving." For the first time the prisoner's expression changed. It was small, so small most people missed it, but Eleanor saw it. Surprise flickered in his dark eyes, not weakness, not gratitude. Just the shock of a man who had not expected mercy and did not quite trust it when it came. Preston Hale stepped closer, lowering his voice as if he spoke sense into a child. "Mrs. Hart, you live alone. Your fences are falling. Your herd is near gone. You cannot afford this kind of madness." "I can afford my own choices." "You don't know what he is." Eleanor looked at the man in chains again, blood on his face, raw wrists, a bruise blooming along his temple. He looked back at her with a steady stare that held pain, pride, and a kind of tired watchfulness. "No," she said quietly, "but I know what you are doing." A murmur moved through the crowd. Preston Hale's face darkened. Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat. "The judge's order says the prisoner must be sold to cover damages. It doesn't say to whom." He held out his hand. "Money." Eleanor stepped onto the jailhouse porch and placed the coins into his palm one by one while the whole town watched. It sounded like a tolling bell, each piece landing with a soft metal click that seemed to mark a line she could never uncross. She knew it, too. By the time the last coin fell into the sheriff's hand, she had spent nearly everything she owned and whatever standing remained to her in Red Hollow. Briggs counted twice, hoping she had come up short. When the total held, his mouth tightened. "Fine," he muttered. "Bill of sale S inside. Comes with the prisoner when I write it proper. I'll take him now." He laughed in disbelief. "Now listen here. I paid, he comes with me now." Hale cut in sharply. "This is a mistake." Eleanor turned on him with such cold anger that for a moment he actually stepped back. The mistake was chaining a wounded man in the square and selling him like an animal. No one spoke. The sheriff cursed under his breath, then dragged the prisoner toward the jailhouse door. "Bring your righteous self inside then, Mrs. Hart, if you're so set on making a fool of yourself." Inside the sheriff's office, the air smelled of ink, sweat, old wood, and iron. Eleanor stood rigid while Briggs scratched out the bill of sale with rough, annoyed strokes. The prisoner remained beside the wall, still silent, the chain hanging between his bound wrists. Up close, he looked even worse. His lower lip was split. There were marks on his throat as though fingers had been there. One sleeve was torn nearly off, revealing bruises layered over older scars. Eleanor swallowed hard. Who beat him? Briggs did not look up, resisted arrest. "Did he?" The sheriff slammed the pen down. "You best remember your place." "My place," Eleanor said, "is the one where I just paid $68 I did not have for a human life you meant to throw away." For a second Briggs looked ready to say something ugly. Then he held out the paper instead. "Take your bill." She folded it carefully and slipped it into her dress pocket. "The key." Briggs tossed it onto the desk. "When he guts you, don't come crying." Eleanor picked up the key and crossed the room. The prisoner watched her every step. He was so still she could hear her own breathing. When she reached for the chain between his wrists, she hesitated just a moment. "I'm taking these off," she said softly. "I won't keep you like this." He studied her and she felt the weight of that gaze all the way to her bones. Then slowly he lifted his bound hands toward her. The key went in hard. Rust fought her. The metal finally gave with a harsh little snap and the shackles opened. Iron dropped to the floor with a heavy clang. The sound seemed to change the room. The man lowered his arms and rubbed his wrists. The raw skin there looked angry and deep. Eleanor had seen injuries before. She had nursed her husband through fever, broken fingers, and a kicked rib before losing him for good to pneumonia 2 winters ago. She knew pain when she saw it. This man had been handled cruelly. "We'll clean those," she said. He looked at her as if testing whether her kindness was real or only another kind of trap. Then, in a deep voice rough from silence, he spoke for the first time. "Why?" It was only one word, but it filled the room. Alina had not been ready for it, for his voice, for the intelligence behind the question, for the simple truth that he was not some mute wild creature from men's stories, but a thinking man asking the most honest thing in the world. She answered just as honestly, because no one else would. His eyes did something then, softened perhaps, though only for a breath. Sheriff Briggs snorted. "Well, ain't that touching?" Alina ignored him. "Can you walk?" The faintest shadow of pride touched the prisoner's mouth. He straightened a little more. "Yes." "Good, my wagon's out front." They stepped back into the square together. Conversation died the moment they emerged. The people of Red Hollow stared openly as Alina came down the porch steps with the former prisoner beside her, his wrists free now, his chains left behind on the sheriff's floor like shed skin. Children were pulled back, men stiffened, women whispered. Preston Hale stepped into their path one last time. "You bring him onto your property, you answer for what follows." Alina met his gaze without blinking. "Then I will answer for it. And when he shows his true nature." Her face hardened. "Maybe the rest of you should worry about showing yours." She walked on. The crowd parted like water before them. Some faces held fear, some disgust. Some looked almost ashamed. Alina felt every eye on her back, every judgment, every warning. It was a heavy thing, public disapproval in a town this small. But beneath it was something else now, something stronger than shame and steadier than fear, purpose. At the wagon, she climbed up first, then turned. "You can ride beside me," she said. He glanced toward the open country beyond town, the long stretch of hills and scrub and river country west of Red Hollow. For one fleeting second, she thought he might run. No man who had just been freed from chains could be blamed for that. But instead he looked back at her, then at the wagon, then placed one hand on the side rail and climbed up beside her. The town watched in silence as Alina Hart took the reins and drove out of Red Hollow with the man everyone had wanted broken. They said later that evening that she had bought herself trouble, that she had invited death onto her land, that grief had finally made her foolish. But none of them had seen what Alina saw as the town fell behind and the open country stretched ahead. The man turned his face toward the wind like someone who had been underwater too long and had only now reached air. His eyes closed for a brief second, not in comfort, not yet, but in relief so deep it hurt to witness. Alina looked at the blood dried on his cheek, the torn skin at his wrists, the bruises, the exhaustion, and she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever the people of Red Hollow chose to call him, whatever stories they told, whatever hatred waited ahead, she had not made a mistake. She had saved a man, and before this was over, she would learn that a saved man could become the very thing that saves you back. The ride to the Hart place took nearly an hour, and neither of them spoke much. The road east of Red Hollow was little more than twin wagon ruts cut through dry grass and hard dirt, winding past low hills, cedar breaks, and patches of land burned pale by late summer heat. Alina kept her eyes forward and her hands steady on the reins, though her thoughts would not settle. Every few minutes she stole a glance at the man beside her. He sat straight despite his obvious pain, one hand braced on the wagon seat, the other resting loose on his thigh. He had the stillness of someone used to danger, the kind that did not come from peace but from surviving too much of its opposite. The blood on his face had dried in a dark line now, dust clung to it. His wrists looked worse in the softer light, red and swollen where the iron had rubbed through skin. Alina wanted to ask a dozen questions, but she held her tongue. A man hauled in chains and sold in a town square did not owe anyone his story the first hour he tasted freedom. At last she said the smallest thing she could think of. "My ranch isn't much." He turned his head slightly, listening. "It used to be better," she went on. Before my husband died. Before the stock thinned. Before half the fences decided they'd rather lie down than stand. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but close enough to surprise her. That happened, he said. His voice was deep and rough but steadier now. Alina felt strange relief at hearing it again. Yes, she said, and for the first time since leaving town she almost smiled. It surely does. They crossed a narrow creek lined with cottonwoods. Alina reined in the team and let the horses drink. The man climbed down from the wagon slowly, favoring his right side this time. When he crouched at the water's edge and cupped the creek water in both hands, she saw him wince. He drank anyway, long and careful, then splashed water over his face, washing away the blood and grime. Fresh bruises came into view. One cheekbone was swollen. There was a cut near his hairline she had not seen before. "You're hurt worse than you let on," she said. He looked back at her, water dripping from his jaw. "I've been worse." She believed him. The truth of it sat heavily in his face. Alina climbed down from the wagon and pulled a small rag from under the seat. She soaked it in the creek and held it out. "Here." For a moment he just looked at the cloth, then at her hand. Caution moved through him like a shadow, but he took it. "Thank you." They stood in silence while the horses drank. Wind moved through the cottonwood leaves with a dry whisper. Somewhere farther off a hawk cried. At last Alina said, "You asked me why." He looked up from cleaning the cut at his temple. "In the sheriff's office," she said, "you asked why I bought you." His eyes rested on her face without expression. "I still don't have a better answer than the one I gave. No one else would. That was enough for me." He rinsed the rag in the creek and said nothing. Then, after a long quiet, he spoke. "In Red Hollow, men called me thief." "Were you?" His gaze shifted to the water. "No." The word came simple and flat. Alina found herself believing him before she had any reason to. "They said I stole 2 geldings from Preston Hale." This time he gave a sound that might have been bitter amusement. "Hale's men took 3 horses from my camp 2 nights before. 1 mine, 2 belonging to my cousin. I went to take back what was ours. They found me first." That explained the bruises. The split lip, the swelling around his eye. It did not explain why the law had sided so cleanly with Preston Hale, but Alina knew that answer already. Men like Hale seldom had trouble finding justice when they wanted it. Men like the one beside her seldom found any at all. "What is your name?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she wondered if he would refuse. Then he said, "Jonah." "Jonah," she repeated. He nodded once. "Jonah Gray Wolf." The name settled between them like something dignified and solid, something that fit him in a way the ugly names from town never could. "I'm Alina Hart," she said. "I know." She almost laughed at that. Of course he knew. The whole town had made sure of it. They rode on as the sun bent lower. By the time they crested the last rise, the Hart place spread below them in tired silence. The house leaned a little to one side. The barn roof sagged at the back corner. One pasture fence had a section down near the far end. What few cattle remained were scattered thin, as if even they doubted the land could keep them. Alina felt heat rise in her face. "I told you it wasn't much." Jonah studied the ranch for a long time. He saw everything. She could tell that at once. Nothing escaped those dark eyes. Then he said, "It could be more." The words hit her so suddenly she forgot how to answer. Most people saw the Hart place and saw failure, a widow's stubbornness, a future already lost. But Jonah looked at broken things and spoke as if he could still imagine them whole. They pulled up near the porch. Alina climbed down and moved toward the team, but Jonah was already there, loosening the traces with practiced hands. "You don't have to do that," she said. He glanced at her. "I know." Yet he did it anyway. Inside, the house was simple and spare. The front room held a wood stove, a scarred table, 2 straight-back chairs, and a shelf of carefully saved jars. A faded quilt lay folded on the settee beneath the front window. Above the fireplace stood a framed photograph of her husband, Daniel Hart, looking younger than the years he had managed to live. smiling with all the certainty of a man who thought hard work and love could beat anything. Alina felt Jonah's eyes go to the photograph. "My husband," she said quietly, "Daniel." "What?" Jonah inclined his head. "He died 2 winters ago." "I'm sorry." It was spoken with no forced pity and no awkwardness, just plain respect. That made it harder to bear. Alina set a lamp on the table and lit it as dusk gathered beyond the windows. "There's a wash basin in the kitchen. I have clean cloths and salve for those wrists." Jonah hesitated in the doorway between the front room and kitchen, as though uncertain how much welcome he was meant to accept. "You can sit," Alina said gently. "You are not a prisoner here." Something flickered in his face then, not relief exactly, something more careful, as if the words mattered to him but he did not dare trust them yet. He sat at the kitchen table. Alina brought warm water, cloths, and the small tin of salve she had used for years on cuts, rope burns, and winter-cracked hands. When she reached for his wrist, she paused. "May I?" He gave one short nod. Up close, the damage looked ugly. The iron had chewed deep into his skin. She cleaned it as gently as she could, but he still went tense under her touch, not from anger, from pain, and perhaps from the strangeness of being tended at all. His hands were large and powerful, marked with old scars and calluses. Working hands. Not the hands of some wild brute from town gossip, but of a man who knew horses, tools, and weather. "Preston Hale's men did more than beat you, didn't they?" she asked quietly. Jonah's jaw hardened. "Enough." Alina let the question die there. She spread the salve carefully and wrapped his wrists with strips torn from an old flour sack. Then she stepped back. "There. Better than chains at least." He looked down at the bandages, flexed his fingers once, then lifted his eyes to hers. "Yes." She made supper while he sat in silence, still and watchful, as if listening to every board creak and every dish touch the table. Beans, cornbread, and the last of the preserved apples from the previous fall. It was not much, but she set 2 places. When she did, Jonah looked at the second plate as though the idea unsettled him more than the chains had. "You'll eat inside," she said. "At the table." He said nothing, but when she sat, he sat too. For a time there was only the sound of spoons, the low hiss of the lamp, and the night wind touching the walls. Alina had not shared a meal with another soul in so long that the silence felt both strange and full. Not lonely silence this time. Living silence. At last Jonah said, "People in town will come." Alina set down her spoon. "I know. They will say you dishonored yourself. They will say worse." "I know that too." He studied her. "Why do it then?" Because she was tired of bowing to small-hearted people. Because she was tired of watching cruelty pass for order. Because she had seen a man in chains hold himself with more dignity than anyone mocking him. Because when she looked at him, bruised and bleeding in that square, she had felt something wake up in her that grief had nearly buried. But the answer she gave was simpler. "Because leaving you, there would have shamed me more." Jonah lowered his eyes to his plate. He did not speak again for a while. After supper, Alina showed him the small room off the kitchen. It had once been meant for hired hands in calving season. It held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a peg on the wall for a coat. The room was plain but clean. "You can sleep here." He looked surprised. "Not the barn." "If I feared you, perhaps the barn. Since I don't, the bed." His face changed in that quiet way of his, emotion moving beneath the surface but never wasting itself. "You trust too easily." "What?" Alina leaned against the doorframe. "No, I choose carefully." That seemed to land somewhere deep. Later, after the lamps were lowered and the house settled into darkness, Alina lay awake in her room listening. She heard the bed in the kitchen room shift once, heard a low sound from outside where the horses moved in the pasture, heard her own heart beating like it had when she was younger and waiting for a storm to break. She should have been afraid. Every soul in Red Hollow had made that clear. Instead, she felt something far more dangerous. Hope. Morning came hard and gold. Alina rose before sunup, dressed, and started coffee on the stove. By the time light spilled over the eastern ridge, Jonah was already outside. She found him near the east fence line studying the broken posts. "You're supposed to be resting," she called. He turned. "Fence won't mend itself." "No," she said, coming closer with 2 cups of coffee. "It has a wicked habit of refusing." He took 1 cup. Their fingers brushed for only a second, but Alina felt it all the way to her chest. Jonah nodded toward the fallen section. "Cattle push through there when they feel ambitious." He took a sip of coffee, then glanced at her over the rim of the tin cup. "And do your cattle feel ambitious?" "Mostly they feel disappointed." That did it. A real smile appeared, brief but unmistakable, and it changed his whole face. It made him look younger, less haunted. More like the man he might have been before hard years and harder men had carved themselves into him. The sight of it struck Alina harder than it should have. By breakfast he had already hauled 3 new posts from the woodpile and set tools beside the fence. Alina tried twice to tell him to slow down, and twice he ignored her with such calm certainty that she almost admired the nerve of it. They worked side by side through the morning. Jonah dug while she held posts steady. He moved with sure strength even with injured wrists, wasting nothing, each motion clean and exact. She found herself watching the way he judged distance, the way he lined wood by eye, the quiet efficiency of him. Daniel had moved like that too, but differently. Daniel had always carried ease with him. Jonah carried control. Around midday, while they paused under the shade of the barn overhang, Alina brought bread and cold ham from the house. Jonah ate slowly, looking out over the pasture. "Who taught you to build?" she asked. "My father, my uncles, anyone older than me with patience enough to correct my mistakes." "He must have been patient." Jonah's gaze remained on the land. He was, but he believed mistakes should teach quickly. The dryness in his voice surprised a laugh out of her before she could stop it. Jonah turned to look at her, and for a second the heaviness around them lifted entirely. Then hoofbeats came from the road. Alina set down her cup and straightened. Jonah was on his feet before the first rider reached the gate. 3 men. Preston Hale in front, of course, with 2 ranch hands behind him. They did not dismount. They sat their horses as if the ground itself belonged to them. Hale smiled without warmth. "Morning, Mrs. Hart." Alina wiped her hands on her skirt. "You're a long way from being welcome." His gaze moved to Jonah and sharpened. "I see your purchase survived the night." "He has a name." "Yes," Hale said, "I'm sure he does." Jonah stood a little behind her and to the left, saying nothing, but Alina felt his presence like a wall at her back. Hale removed his gloves finger by finger. "I came as a neighbor, to advise caution. A woman alone on poor land can't afford bad choices." "My choices are my own." "I heard you spent nearly every coin you had yesterday. That true?" "That is also none of your concern." Hale leaned slightly in the saddle. "Everything east of the creek concerns me, especially when foolishness threatens order." Alina's hands curled at her sides. "Order? Is that what you call beating a man half senseless and selling him in town?" The 2 ranch hands shifted awkwardly. Hale's face cooled. "You know nothing of what happened." "I know enough." He looked at Jonah again. "He'll turn on you." "No. That confidence will die hard." Jonah spoke then, voice low and steady. "I am standing here." The simple fact of hearing him answer seemed to irritate Hale more than if Jonah had shouted. "You'd best remember where you are," Hale snapped. Jonah's eyes did not leave his. "I do." For one long second the air between them felt sharp enough to cut. Alina could almost see the hatred in Hale, old and practiced, wrapped up in self-importance and fear. At last he looked back to her. "This can still be fixed, Mrs. Hart. Sell me the north pasture, send him away. Let people forget your mistake." The answer rose from somewhere deep and fierce. "Get off my land." One of the ranch hands muttered something under his breath. Alina did not catch the words, but Jonah did. His jaw tightened. Hale gathered his reins. "You'll regret this." Perhaps, Eleanor said, but not half as much as I'd regret becoming like you. Hale's face went hard as stone. He wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following. Only when they were gone did Eleanor realize her hands were shaking. Jonah saw it too. They will come again. Yes. He looked at the road a long moment, then at her. You could still send me away. The idea struck her like a slap. No. He held her gaze. This is not charity anymore, she said, her voice unsteady with emotion she had not meant to show. I made a choice in that square. I will not crawl backward from it because men like Preston Hale disapprove. A slow breath left him. Then we stand. The words settled over her with the weight of a vow. That evening, the sky darkened early with a bank of low clouds rolling in from the west. Wind pressed against the house and carried dust through every crack that the old walls had not yet learned to resist. Eleanor lit lamps earlier than usual. Jonah came in after securing the barn and setting extra water for the horses. Rain began just after supper, hard and sudden. It hammered the roof and rattled the loose shutter outside the front room. Eleanor rose with a sigh. That shutter has been cursing me for 3 months. Jonah stood before she could reach the door. I'll do it. You can hardly feel your wrists. He already had his coat in hand. I can still climb. Before she could argue further, he stepped into the storm. Eleanor stood at the window and watched him through streaks of rain and lamp glow. He moved fast along the porch, climbed the side rail, and caught the shutter before the wind could tear it free entirely. For one terrible second he slipped. Her breath stopped. Then he found his footing and drove the loose hinge back into place with 2 sharp strikes from the hammer he had taken from the kitchen peg. When he came back inside, he was wet through, hair dark with rain, water running from his sleeves. You are impossible, Eleanor said. He looked almost amused. Shutter is quieter now. She grabbed a towel and pushed it at his chest. Sit by the stove before you freeze. He obeyed this time. She brought him dry cloth from one of Daniel's old shirts, patched and soft from use. Jonah looked at it in his hands before glancing up at her. It's all I have that might fit. He changed in the kitchen room while she stared at the stove, and pretended her heart had no business beating that way. When he came back out in Daniel's shirt, the familiar cloth on a stranger's body did something strange and painful inside her. Not because it looked wrong, because it didn't. They sat by the fire with the storm pressing at the windows. Jonah's damp hair lay loose against his shoulders. Shadows from the flames moved over his face, softening the bruises, deepening the quiet in his eyes. After a long silence he said, Your husband, he was kind. Eleanor's throat tightened. Yes. Loved this land. He loved anything that promised a future. Jonah nodded. And you? She looked into the fire. I loved him. The land came with him at first. Then after he died, I suppose I stayed for both of them, him and the dream. Jonah was quiet. He would not have liked what happened in town yesterday, she said after a while. Daniel could be stubborn, but he hated cruelty. Jonah's voice came low. Then I would have honored him. She turned to look at him. He meant it, not as politeness, as truth. Rain beat harder against the house. The fire snapped. And you? She asked softly, who taught you mercy? His face changed, not closed exactly but deepened with memory. My mother, he said. My father taught strength. She taught when not to use it. Eleanor waited. She said a man becomes dangerous twice. Once when he learns violence, again when he mistakes violence for power. The words held an old echo as if repeated from years away. She sounds wise, Eleanor said. She was. Something in the simplicity of that answer nearly broke her heart. The storm wore on. The house, for all its age, held together. Outside, the land drank deeply. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. Eleanor should have gone to bed sooner, but neither of them moved. At last Jonah said, in town when they shouted, when they looked at me like an animal, you did not look away. No. Why? This time his voice carried more than curiosity. It carried the weight of a man who had lived too long unseen. Alina met his gaze across the firelight. Because you were enduring more pain with more dignity than any man in that square deserved to witness. For the first time, Jonah looked shaken. He lowered his eyes, and when he spoke again his voice was rougher than before. No one has spoken to me that way in many years. Alina did not trust herself to answer. The fire burned down to red coals. Rain softened to a steady whisper. At last she stood. You should sleep, she said. He rose too. For a moment they stood close in the low light, close enough that Alina could see the fine scar near his left brow, close enough to smell rain and wood smoke on him. She had not stood this near a man since Daniel. The knowledge came sharp and startling. Good night, Jonah. He held her gaze. Good night, Alina. She went to her room and closed the door, but sleep did not come easily. The storm passed near midnight. The land outside smelled fresh and dark. In the silence after rain, every thought seemed louder. By morning, the world had changed. The pastures shimmered under clean light. The creek ran fuller. Mud clung to boots. The east field looked almost hopeful. Alina stood on the porch with coffee in hand and watched Jonah already moving through the yard, checking the horses, testing the latch on the barn, scanning the road as if some part of him never stopped standing watch. A rider came just after breakfast. Young Caleb Mercer from the neighboring ranch reined in at the gate, hat in hand and nerves written all over him. He was barely 20 and honest enough to blush when lying became necessary, which made him a poor fit for frontier gossip. Mrs. Hart, he called, I thought you should know. There was talk in town last night. Alina felt a familiar chill. From whom? Mostly Hale's men and Reverend Pike. They're saying you've lost decency, saying that man under your roof is a danger to every woman in the valley. Jonah had gone very still behind her. Caleb looked ashamed just repeating it. There's worse. Hale says if the law won't fix the problem, decent men might have to. Alina felt anger rise so fast it almost made her light-headed. Did you come here to warn me, she asked, or to judge me? To warn you, ma'am, I swear it. She believed him. Caleb Mercer had gentle eyes and little taste for cruelty. Thank you, she said. He hesitated, then glanced at Jonah. For what it's worth, sir, my little sister was there in the square. She said you never looked scared. Said you looked sadder than angry. I don't know why, but she kept talking about that all night. Jonah said nothing. Caleb flushed deeper. I just thought maybe you should know not everybody believes the worst. With that he tipped his hat and rode off. Alina stood staring at the road long after he disappeared. They may come tonight, Jonah said. Yes. He looked at the barn, the house, the thin fields, measuring them as he measured everything. Then we prepare. They spent the day working, but not only at repairs. Jonah strengthened the bar on the front door. He checked every window latch. He cleaned Daniel's old shotgun and set it above the mantel within easy reach. He said very little while doing it. Alina said less. The air between them held a new kind of tension now, not distrust, readiness. Near sunset, when the sky turned copper and the shadows lengthened, Jonah stood at the porch rail looking out over the road. You should leave, Alina said suddenly. He turned. If they come for you, she said, forcing each word out, you could still get clear. The West Ridge gives cover, you know that now. His expression did not change, but something in it sharpened. You want me gone? The thought hurt more than she had expected. No. Then don't ask. They may kill you. They may try. She stepped closer, anger and fear tangling inside her. Must you answer everything like that? His eyes held hers. Must you ask me to run when you know I won't? Neither of them moved. The wind stirred her loose hair across her cheek. Jonah lifted one hand as if to brush it back, then stopped himself before touching her. The halted gesture struck deeper than a touch might have. At last he said, quieter, you paid for my freedom. I decide what to do with it, and I decide to stay. Alina's throat tightened. She could not argue with that. Night gathered slowly. She made supper, though neither of them ate much. The lamps burned low. Every sound outside seemed larger than it should have. Once a coyote cried. Once the horses stirred sharply enough that Jonah stepped onto the porch with Daniel's revolver in hand before deciding it was only the wind. By full dark, Alina had moved the extra lamp into the front room. Jonah stood near the door listening. Then far off at first came the sound of hooves, more than one rider. Alina set down her cup. Jonah reached for the shotgun and handed it to her without a word. They looked at each other across the lamplight, both knowing that whatever had begun in the town square had now followed them home. Hoofbeats rolled closer through the dark like a warning drum. Alina stood in the front room with the shotgun braced in both hands, her heart striking hard against her ribs. Jonah moved beside her with a stillness that did not look like fear but readiness. The lamp on the table cast a soft circle of gold through the room, leaving the corners in shadow. Outside, the horses in the pasture shifted and snorted. The whole ranch seemed to be listening. The riders stopped in the yard. For one long second no one moved. Then a voice came from the darkness. "Mrs. Hart, open up." Alina knew it at once. Reverend Pike. She felt anger rise through the fear. Of course he had come. Men who liked power dressed their cruelty in righteousness whenever they could. And tonight he had brought company. Jonah glanced toward her. How many? She listened, counting the horses, the low creak of saddle leather, the murmur of male voices. 5, maybe 6. Jonah nodded once. Stay behind the door when you open it. I'm not hiding. His eyes met hers in the low light. Not hiding, surviving. Something in his voice made her obey. Alina lifted the wooden bar, opened the door only far enough to stand in it, and kept the shotgun visible. Reverend Pike sat his horse in front, black coat hanging around him like a crow's wings. Beside him were 2 of Preston Hale's ranch hands, one of the Mercer twins from South Creek and the Harmon brothers from town, both of them mean-eyed and half-drunk by the look of them. Torches burned in 2 hands, throwing wild orange light across faces already twisted by certainty. Pike looked from Alina to the gun and frowned as if disappointed she had not greeted him meekly. "We've come to help you," he said. "With torches?" Alina asked. Jim Harmon spat into the dirt. "Women should be grateful decent men are willing to clean up her mess." Jonah stepped into view behind her. The reaction was instant. The men on horseback stiffened. One of Hale's hands reached toward his belt before catching himself. Pike lifted a hand. "No one wants blood tonight." That was the first lie. Alina saw it in the way the men spread out, in the way one torch was angled toward the barn, not the house, in the way fear and hate had already made them imagine themselves justified. "What do you want?" she asked. Pike drew himself up like a man standing in a pulpit. "Send him away, tonight, before this goes any further. The whole valley is talking. Families are frightened. Your behavior has brought shame, scandal, and danger where there ought to be peace." "My behavior?" Alina's voice sharpened. "A gang of men rides onto my land after dark carrying fire, and you mean to lecture me on peace?" The Mercer boy looked uneasy at that, but the Harmon brothers did not. Pete Harmon leaned forward in his saddle. "You took in a savage. What did you expect?" Jonah's jaw tightened. Alina felt it without looking. "He has a name," she said, "and if none of you came to use it, then you came for no good purpose." Pike's eyes turned cold. "This is your last chance, Mrs. Hart. We will not stand by while sin grows bold." Alina almost laughed at the ugliness of it. "Sin? Is that what you call feeding a hungry man? Tending wounds your kind helped make? Seeing humanity where the rest of you see something to use and fear?" Hale's foreman, Curtis Bell, spoke up then. "Careful now, you're talking to a man of God." "No," Alina said. "I'm talking to a coward wearing scripture like a mask." The words landed hard. Pike's face went pale with fury. Jonah stepped a little closer to the threshold. "Leave." It was not loud. It did not need to be. Curtis Bell sneered. "Or what?" Jonah's dark eyes stayed fixed on him. "Or you prove her right about what kind of men you are." For a second no one answered. Wind moved through the yard. One horse stamped. The torchlight danced over the barn roof, and Alina had the sharp, sick feeling that one spark was all it would take to turn the whole place into flame. Then Pete Harmon grinned, ugly and reckless. "Maybe we ought to smoke him out." He moved his arm. Jonah was faster. 1 second the torch was in Pete's hand. The next, Jonah had crossed the porch and struck his wrist with such clean force the torch flew into the dirt. Alina had never seen a man move like that. Not wild, not sloppy, precise, controlled. Pete shouted and yanked back, clutching his arm. Everything broke loose. Jim Harmon swung down from his horse with a curse. Curtis Bell reached for his pistol. Alina raised the shotgun and leveled it straight at his chest. "Don't," she said. Her voice cracked across the yard harder than the gun would have. Curtis froze. Pike began shouting about law and order, but nobody was listening now. The Mercer boy had backed his horse away, fear finally stronger than whatever talk had brought him here. Jim Harmon lunged toward the porch, and Jonah met him halfway. There was no wasted motion. Jonah caught the man's arm, turned him, and sent him hard into the porch rail. The wood groaned. Jim hit the dirt, cursing. Pete, still half in the saddle, fumbled for the dropped torch. Alina fired. She aimed high on purpose. The blast tore through the night and sent birds exploding out of the cottonwoods near the creek. The horses reared. Pete yelled and threw himself backward. Smoke filled the porch. "Next one won't miss," Alina said. Everything went still. The sound of the shot rolled away over the dark fields. Then from farther down the road came an answering sound. More riders. For one dizzy second Alina thought the worst had come, that Hale himself had brought the rest of his men. Then a voice shouted from the darkness. "Hold where you are." Sheriff Nolan Briggs rode into the yard with 2 deputies behind him and old Lars Olson just beyond them carrying a rifle across his lap. Tom Bradley followed too, hatless and breathless as if he had ridden hard. Briggs took in the whole scene at once. Pete Harmon clutching his wrist, Jim in the dirt, torches, guns, a widow on her porch with smoke still curling from the barrel of her shotgun. His face went dark. "What in God's name is this?" Tom Bradley pointed straight at Pike. "I told you they were riding out here, Sheriff. Said if you didn't come fast there'd be blood." Pike found his voice again. "We came to persuade, peacefully." Lars Olson spat to the side. "Peacefully, with fire. I was born at night, preacher, not last night." Curtis Bell straightened in the saddle, trying to recover his authority. "This woman is harboring a dangerous man." Briggs looked at Alina, then at Jonah, then at the torches in the dirt. "What I see," the sheriff said slowly, "is a group of armed men on private property after dark threatening a woman in her own home." Pike sputtered, "You cannot mean to take their side." Briggs's mouth tightened. "Tonight I take the law's side, and the law says you men have no business here." He pointed toward the road. "Go home, every one of you, before I decide attempted arson and armed intimidation are worth dragging back to town." Jim Harmon climbed to his feet with murder in his eyes, but one look at Briggs's deputies cooled him. Pete swore under his breath and gathered his reins with his good hand. Curtis Bell glared at Jonah as if trying to promise future trouble. Pike looked worst of all, because his pride had been bruised in public. "This will not end well," he said to Alina. "No," she answered, "not for men who keep choosing evil and naming it virtue." The riders turned one by one and left the yard in a churn of dust and resentment. Only when the last hoofbeat faded did Alina feel her knees weaken. Jonah stepped beside her at once, one hand hovering near her elbow without touching, making sure she was steady, making sure she chose whether to lean. Tom Bradley climbed down from his horse. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I heard them talking in town and rode straight for the sheriff's office." "You may have saved all our lives," Alina said. He looked embarrassed. Mr. Olson was already there, said he had a feeling something ugly was brewing. Lars grunted. "Ugly men don't stay quiet long." Briggs dismounted at last and came to the porch. He looked older in the low light than Alina remembered, more tired too. "You all right?" "For now." He glanced at the shotgun in her hands. "You nearly took Pete Harmon's hat clean off." I was aiming at the dark above his head." Briggs gave the smallest huff, almost a laugh though it carried no humor. "I guessed." His gaze shifted to Jonah. There was still caution there, but something else had entered it. Respect perhaps, or the beginning of it. "You could have killed Harmon." Jonah answered simply, "I didn't." Briggs nodded once. "No, you didn't." He looked back at Alina. "Lock up tight tonight anyway. I'll make it known in town that anyone rides out here again without cause, I'll treat it like what it is." "Thank you, Sheriff." He seemed uncomfortable receiving gratitude from her, maybe because he had earned little of it before now. After they rode off, silence returned in pieces. The yard smelled of burned powder and horse sweat. One dropped torch still smoked in the dirt until Jonah kicked soil over it. Alina leaned the shotgun against the wall and pressed both hands flat to the porch post, willing her breathing to calm. "You were not wrong," Jonah said quietly. "About them." "No," she swallowed, "and they won't be done." "No." The truth of that sat between them, but another truth stood beside it now. They had not faced the night alone. Tom Bradley had ridden for help. Lars Olsen had come armed and ready. Even the sheriff had chosen law over pressure and gossip. The valley had not changed all at once, but a crack had opened in the wall of hatred and light had found it. Inside the house, Alina reloaded the shotgun with steady hands. Jonah barred the door and checked the windows. When the last lamp was lowered, neither of them went to bed. They sat by the stove in the front room while the fire burned low. After a long while, Alina said, "You could have run tonight." Jonah looked at the coals. "Yes. But you stayed." He turned then, his face half shadowed, half firelight. "I told you, I decide what to do with my freedom." Her throat tightened. "And you decided to fight for mine." Something changed in his eyes at that, not surprise, recognition. "Yes," he said. The next morning dawned cold and bright, with the kind of clear sky that made every line of the land stand out sharp. Alina expected the valley to feel hostile after the night before. Instead it felt watchful, as if everyone waited to see what version of the story would spread first. By noon she had her answer. Martha Reed came in a wagon with fresh bread and a jar of blackberry preserves. Martha was not one of Alina's close friends, but she had always been decent, which in Red Hollow often made a person seem braver than they knew. "I heard what happened," Martha said, climbing down. "Heard it from my husband before Pike could poison it." She handed over the bread. "No woman should face that alone." "We didn't," Alina said softly. Martha looked past her to where Jonah was repairing a gate hinge. He rose when he noticed them, wiping his hands on his trousers. Martha straightened. "Mr. Gray Wolf." Jonah nodded. "Ma'am." "My husband says you showed more restraint than most white men would have with a drunk charging them in the dark." She glanced at Alina. "I'd say that's worth more than one loaf, but it's what I had hot from the oven." Alina nearly laughed with relief. That afternoon Tom Bradley came with nails and a message from his father that if anyone on the Hart place needed tending after the night's trouble, the doctor would come without charge. Toward evening, Lars Olsen rode by again, slow and steady, only to tip his hat and make sure the place still stood. Small things. But frontier life was built from small things. A loaf of bread, a warning carried in time, a neighbor choosing to stop instead of turning away. 3 days later came the thing no one had expected. A storm rolled through at dusk, full of hard rain and lightning that struck dry country too close for comfort. Near midnight a bolt hit the old schoolhouse in Red Hollow. The roof caught fast. Bells rang. Men ran with buckets. Women gathered children. Alina and Jonah saw the glow from their porch and were already hitching the wagon before the second bell sounded. By the time they reached town, the schoolhouse was half lit with flame from the rear corner. The whole square churned with confusion. Reverend Pike shouted instructions no one followed. Sheriff Briggs tried to organize a line to the well. Mothers cried out for missing children who had been there late, helping the schoolmarm prepare for autumn lessons. "Lucy Bell is inside," someone screamed. "She was fetching copybooks." Curtis Bell, Preston Hale's foreman, went white under the firelight. It was his daughter. No one moved toward the door. The back of the building was already burning. Smoke poured through the front like black cloth. Then Jonah was gone. Eleanor saw him run and felt the world stop. He vanished into the schoolhouse before Curtis Bell could even shout his name. Men cursed. Women prayed. Briggs ordered 2 more bucket lines. Eleanor could do nothing but stand in the rain with her hands clenched, so tight her nails bit into her palms. Seconds dragged. The roof groaned. Then Jonah emerged through the smoke carrying a little girl in his arms. Lucy Bell was coughing and crying, her hair singed at one side but alive. Jonah stumbled once on the schoolhouse steps, recovered, and crossed the muddy yard through steam and sparks. Curtis Bell met him halfway, taking his daughter with shaking hands. For a second no one spoke. Then Lucy buried her face in her father's neck and sobbed. "He found me." The whole square changed. Eleanor felt it as clearly as if wind had shifted. All the whispers, the suspicion, the stories men had told themselves about Jonah Gray Wolf cracked under the sight of a man blackened with soot handing a white rancher his living child. Curtis Bell stared at Jonah as though seeing him for the first time. Shame hit his face hard and plain. "I rode to your place," he said hoarsely. "I threatened that woman. I called you." He swallowed. "And you still went in for her." Jonah's chest rose and fell hard from smoke and effort. "She was a child." That was all. Curtis Bell lowered his eyes. "I was wrong." Others heard it. Eleanor saw it move through the crowd, heard it in the hush, in the sudden discomfort of men who had been too ready to follow Pike and Hale. Sheriff Briggs stepped forward, his expression grim but clear. "Everyone here heard that," he said. "Best remember it." Even Reverend Pike said nothing. Perhaps because there was no sermon big enough to stand against a rescued child. Perhaps because cowardice always shrank when virtue stopped being abstract and started breathing in front of witnesses. Mrs. Whitlow, the preacher's wife, approached slowly, as if crossing some line inside herself. She looked from Jonah to Eleanor, then lifted a trembling hand to her mouth. "My God," she whispered, "we were blind." Eleanor did not answer. She could not. Her eyes were fixed on Jonah, on the soot on his face, the damp hair at his temple, the slight favoring of his left leg that told her he had hurt himself in the schoolhouse and would claim he had not. The fire was contained before dawn. The schoolhouse was damaged but standing. By sunrise nearly the entire town had seen Jonah save Lucy Bell. People looked at him differently after that, some with wonder, some with shame. Some with the humbled look of those forced to admit they had mistaken prejudice for wisdom. That afternoon, Red Hollow did something else no one had expected. The townspeople came to the Hart place, not as a mob this time, as neighbors. First Tom Bradley with lumber left over from a barn repair. Then Martha Reed with seed potatoes. Then Doc Bradley with fresh bandages and a bottle of liniment for Jonah's smoke-burned arm. Then Curtis Bell himself, hat in hand, asking if the east pasture gate still needed mending because he knew ironwork and meant to put his hands where his apology was. By evening half the valley seemed to have found some excuse to stop by. A fence got reset. The barn roof was patched. One widow brought jars. Another brought hens. Lars Olsen came with 2 sturdy calves he claimed were too rowdy for his own pasture and therefore surely belonged with Eleanor. Nobody believed that story, but no one challenged it. The Hart place, silent and struggling for so long, rang with hammers and voices and work. Eleanor stood in the yard near sunset and looked around in something like disbelief. The north fence stood straight. Fresh boards lay stacked by the barn. Smoke rose warm from her chimney. Men who would once have crossed the road rather than greet Jonah now asked his opinion on beams, horses, and weather signs. He stood among them easily, not proud, not boastful, not eager for praise, just himself. Quiet, strong, certain. And then Preston Hale rode in. The yard went still. He looked from the repaired fence to the gathered neighbors to Jonah beside the barn and finally to Eleanor. Hatred had not left him, but something weaker had entered it now. Isolation. "Quite a gathering," he said. Curtis Bell stepped away from the wagon wheel he had been fixing. "You should go, Mr. Hale." Hale turned sharply. Excuse me. You heard me. It spread from there. Tom Bradley moved closer to Jonah. Lars Olson rested both hands on his rifle. Sheriff Briggs, who had arrived not 5 minutes earlier to inspect the schoolhouse repairs at the edge of town, happened to be riding up the road and paused at the gate with a look that suggested he would enjoy an excuse to enforce the law. For the first time since Alina had known him, Preston Hale looked outnumbered not in men but in moral ground. "This isn't over," he said at last, though the words had gone thin. Alina met his gaze. "For you, perhaps it is." He looked at Jonah one last time, but whatever threat he had once carried no longer held the same weight. Not here, not now. He turned his horse and rode away without another word. Only when he was gone did the yard breathe again. Work resumed. Voices rose. Someone laughed. The sound felt almost unbelievable on that land. By twilight the neighbors were heading home one by one, leaving behind repaired things, promised help, and a silence that no longer felt empty. Alina stood on the porch as the last wagon rolled out. Jonah came up the steps slowly. His shirt sleeves were rolled, his forearms streaked with dust and soot, his hair touched gold by the dying light. "They came," Alina said softly. "Yes. I thought if the town ever changed it would be slow, quiet, maybe not at all." Jonah looked out over the yard. Sometimes fire destroys, sometimes it clears ground for new growth. She turned to him then. "You nearly died twice this week." He looked back at her. "And yet I am still here." Emotion rose in her so sharply it almost stole her breath. Fear, relief, gratitude, longing, all of it braided together too tightly to separate anymore. "I cannot keep pretending this is only about gratitude," she said. His face softened. "Nor can I," he answered. The wind moved gently through the yard. Somewhere beyond the pasture a horse whickered low. The whole world seemed to narrow to the porch, the fading light, and the man standing before her. "I bought your freedom," Alina said, her voice shaking now. "But somewhere along the way, Jonah, you gave mine back to me. You brought life into this place again. Into me." He stepped closer. "You saw a man worth saving," he said. "You became the woman worth living for." The words hit her with such force that tears sprang to her eyes. And then he touched her, one hand rising slowly to her cheek, giving her all the time in the world to turn away. She didn't. Alina leaned into his palm, closed her hand around his wrist, and kissed him. It was not shy. It was not uncertain. It was the kiss of two people who had stood in grief, fire, hatred, and fear, and found each other anyway. A kiss full of all the words they had not said soon enough. When they parted, Jonah rested his forehead lightly against hers. "Alina." She smiled through tears. "Yes." Inside the house the lamp glowed warm. Outside the Hart place stood straighter than it had in years. The fences were mended, the barn would hold winter. The land looked less like something dying and more like something waiting. News spread fast after that. Some still muttered. Some always would. But most of Red Hollow learned a new story. Not about a savage bought in a square. About a man named Jonah Gray Wolf who saved children from fire, worked honest, stood brave, and returned dignity to a place that had nearly lost its soul. About a widow named Alina Hart who saw worth where others saw threat, and refused to bow when small people demanded it. Before the first frost, neighbors raised a new section of barn wall at the Hart place. Before the first snow, Curtis Bell brought a mare he said Jonah should have for his own. Before Christmas, Mrs. Whitlow herself left a pie on Alina's porch with a note that said only, "I was wrong." And when spring came again, green and wild and full of second chances, the Heartland looked alive. Not because trouble had vanished, not because prejudice had been erased, but because courage had met cruelty and refused to move. Because one woman had looked into a town square full of fear and said, "Don't hurt him, I'll buy him." Because she had seen what everyone else was too small to see. A man worth saving. And in the end, she was right.